Hi everyone and welcome to this new video where I'm going to talk about how to identify chords by ear. To be clearer, I will talk about how to identify the exact chords that you're listening to by ear alone without any musical instruments. So this tutorial will not be just about recognizing the quality of the chords, so whether it's major or minor or whatever. It will be a guide on how to recognize the exact chord so that you can actually take your instrument and play the exact chord right away. Before going ahead with the video, I invite you to subscribe to the channel by clicking the subscribe button below and also to leave a like to the video. Lastly, if you haven't heard about it before, we have a 3-hour-long free workshop on ear training that includes a ton of valuable content about how to practice your training in an effective way, about understanding the scientific findings behind the correct way to practice your training, about understanding what exercises you should avoid. It will also explain what are the reasons why you're stuck on traditional ear training methods, and we will show you what you should do, what you should practice instead, depending on your current level. So at this moment in time, it's still free, so you can access it without paying anything. So if you're interested in your training, I strongly recommend you check it out. You can find a link in the description section down below. Just sign up to it, and we're confident that you will find it very, very helpful. Okay, back to the topic on how to identify chords by ear. First of all, a couple years ago, I made another video on this topic, and that video actually includes the scientific researches and references to the scientific studies that back up everything I'm going to say in this video. So if you want to have a reference to the scientific studies and the scientific background that is at the core of what I'm going to say in this video, you can check out that other video by following the link above or in the description section below. Okay, so let's talk about how to identify chords by ear. Well, there are actually multiple ways that you can do that. I'm not going to talk about all of them because it doesn't make sense. I'm just going to focus on the two most useful and applicable approaches to identifying chords by ear. I call these two approaches the zoom in method and the zoom out method. So these two terms refer to the cognitive process involved in recognizing chords by ear. So the zoom in method is a specific cognitive process and the zoom out method is a different cognitive process. Even though these are both applicable and useful, the zoom out method is the best. Let's now understand what these two cognitive processes involve. Let's start with the zoom in method. Identifying a chord by using the zoom in method requires that you basically recognize each individual note included in the chord. And thus, from understanding all the notes that are included in a chord, you can then, with a little music theory knowledge, you can then understand which chord it is. For example, if you hear a chord and you can recognize that it includes the notes C, E, and G, you automatically know that the chord is C major. So this is what a lot of students actually try to do at first when approaching chord identification tasks. But it's not the best way because, as you can understand, it involves a lot of cognitive processes because you have to understand each note at first, and then after you know each note included in the chord, you can understand what chord it is. So it's not optimal, it's not fast enough to be easily applied in real musical scenarios. Moreover, a lot of students actually apply ineffective and inefficient cognitive processes in actually identifying each individual note. For example, a lot of students try to recognize the individual notes by thinking of intervals. And as you've probably heard in other videos that I've made, I don't suggest students to follow an interval-based thought process. So I don't suggest you actually think interval by interval, or you actually try to recognize intervals in order to recognize notes or chords. That's by far one of the most ineffective way you can adopt. And I've made a specific video about why interval-based ear training is not a good approach to ear training. You will find the link to it up here or in the description section below. But that's not the only inefficient approach to identifying individual notes. Another commonly used inefficient approach is the trial and error approach, for example. This includes those situations in which a musician helps himself with an instrument and plays random notes on his instrument until he stumbles upon the same note that he's trying to recognize. So I've also made a specific video on this common mistake in your training. You will find a link to it up here. That being said, as you can understand, the zoom-in method is not a bad approach per se, but most people will unintentionally approach it in an ineffective way, using either interval-based thinking or a trial and error approach. So the right way to identify chords using the zoom-in method is to actually identify the scale degree of each individual note included in the chord. Of course, you need to practice and to develop your ability to recognize scale degrees intuitively. And that's one of the most important aspects that we tackle in our video course and in our method. So I won't digress too much on how to recognize individual notes. You will find other videos on that in this channel. But just so you understand, recognizing scale degrees is the best way to approach identifying chords by ear using a zoom-in method. Okay, that's all for the zoom-in approach. Let's now talk about the zoom-out approach. The zoom-out approach involves identifying chords by ear by focusing on the global sound that each chord has. It's important to understand that the music that we listen to and that we usually identify as music instead of random noise, it's because it's based on a tonality. It's played in a musical key or maybe multiple musical key, but there's always a musical key in place. So that's the first point that should be clear. And this leads me to the actual point I wanted to make, which is that inside the tonality, there are 7 chords, okay? So we can build one chord on each degree of the scale, basically, okay? This means that we have 7 chords inside a key. The important thing to know is that each one of these 7 chords has a very specific feeling, a very specific sensation, okay? Of happiness, sadness, stability, instability, and whatsoever. So if you train yourself to internalize, to memorize the sensation of these 7 chords, these 7 different sensations, you will actually be able to recognize these sensations in real music whenever a chord is played in a real song or musical piece. Indeed, the vast majority of the songs that you're going to listen to will include just these 7 chords in different combinations played with different rhythms, but as soon as you can recognize these 7 chords, these 7 feelings, you will be able to recognize like 95% of the chord progressions in songs that you usually listen to. So I hope the point came through, because that's the reason why it's so important to approach identifying chords using the zoom out method. Because when you know the feeling of each chord, when you actually can recognize the chord by feeling, oh, that's the 1st degree chord, or that's the 5th degree chord. Like you recognize visual color, for example. There's no thinking involved, right? You can see blue and you know, oh, it's blue. You don't have to think about, oh, it seems like that and it reminds me of that. No, you just recognize it as blue. In the same way, applying the zoom out method, you can recognize chords very intuitively and very quickly. Again, how you do that, you focus on feeling the global sensation of the chord without focusing on each individual note, because that's not going to help you. You have to feel the global sensation that the chords gives you. Maybe it's a feeling of tension that demands for resolution, and that might be, for example, the 5th degree chord, the dominant chord. But describing them to you is not going to really make any difference. You have to experience these feelings, these sensations through a set of gradual and progressive exercises that are going to help you internalize these feelings, these 7 sensations, so that you can then recognize them when you hear them in real songs. And I know that at this point you can have a question, which is, okay, let's say that I'm able to recognize a chord by ear using the zoom out method. But how do I know whether the chord is major, minor, or whatever? Well, the answer to this is very simple, because the chord can be major, minor, diminished, etc., depending on the degree of the scale they are built on. For example, in the major key, the 1st, 4th, 5th chord are major chords. The 2nd, 3rd, and 6th chords are minor and the 7th is diminished. So this remains the same for every major key. So as you can understand, as soon as you are able to recognize which degree the chord is built on, you also know if the chord is major or minor without even having to worry about recognizing the quality of the chord. Well, that being said, let me clarify one last thing about zoom in and zoom out method, which is that there are a few cases in which it is a good idea to mix these two approaches together, to use both at the same time, or let's say a bit of one approach and a bit of the other. Well, the main scenario where I suggest you adopt a kind of a mixed approach is when transcribing classical music or when performing traditional harmonic dictation exercises. Because in those situations, you will have to write down the actual part that each instrument is playing. So as you can understand, in that case, it's a good idea to also use the zoom in method to focus on each individual instrument in specific. But for everything else, for every other musical genre where chords are played as distinct blocks, so they are fully separated from one another, and you can hear a clear transition from one chord to the next, like pop, jazz, rock, blues, whatever, folk, electronic music, whatever, the zoom out method is by far the best approach you can adopt. It's the fastest, the easiest, the most intuitive one, and it's the only one that allows you to recognize chords in the same way you recognize colors, for example, so in a very intuitive and non-rational way. And I strongly recommend you to work on developing this cognitive process because it's really, really important not only for identifying chords by ear, but also for improving your melodic ear. Because you might not be aware of that, but working on the harmonic ear, so working on chord progression recognition, etc., will actually help your melodic ear a lot because these two things are not independent, are not separate. They are closely connected together. And so by working on one side, you actually also develop the other side. I won't digress too much on this topic, but I think this is something you should be aware of. Okay, before ending the video, I just want to talk about a very common mistake that a lot of musicians make without being aware of, which is the fact of practicing only chord quality recognition exercises and expecting that just practicing these exercises will allow them to recognize chords by ear effortlessly as described in this video. Well, what are chord quality recognition exercises? These are exercises where you are actually asked to recognize the quality of a chord. So whether a chord is major, minor, major 7th, dominant 7th, etc. These exercises are very common, especially in ear training apps, because they are very easy to make, but they only allow you to improve your ability to recognize the quality of the chord and not the chord itself. Long story short, by focusing only on these kinds of exercises, you won't be able to recognize chords by ear because you will only be able to recognize their quality, but not which chord they actually are. You still don't know which chord to play on your instrument. You just know it's major or minor, but you don't know what to play. Whereas, for example, applying the zoom out method, you understand which chord it is, and by knowing which scale you are playing in, you actually also know if the chord is major or minor without even worrying about recognizing whether the chord is major or minor. So that's another reason why you should focus on training your zoom out method instead of practicing chord quality recognition exercises. Anyway, I made a specific video on the issues of chord quality recognition exercises. You will find a link to it up here and in the description section below. Lastly, as I said before, if you want to dig deeper into the scientific references that are at the core of everything I've said in this video, you can check out my previous video on chord progressions recognition. You will find a link to it in the description section below. Okay, that's all for this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and also don't forget to check out our site. You will find all our courses there. You will find our free workshop. Again, it's full of valuable content for anyone interested in ear training. You will discover a lot of new things about ear training, how to practice effectively, what to avoid. You will see a science-based model that shows how great musicians are able to recognize chords, notes on the fly without any efforts, and how everyone can achieve the same level by working in the proper way. All the relevant links to our website and to our workshop are in the description section below. Please let me know if you have any questions by writing in the comment section down below. That being said, it's all for this video. I thank you very much for watching and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.